They said, "Don't sit near us." Just like that. No whisper, no hesitation. Just a flat instruction, like someone telling a dog to stay. It came from Emma's mouth, but not just her voice. It came from every woman who's ever decided an old face would ruin the photo. She didn't even look at me when she said it, just flicked her eyes over like she was checking for stains. She was wearing white blouse, white sneakers, clean, straight teeth. And I, apparently, didn't match. I had chosen my soft navy dress for the occasion, the one with buttons that still shine a little when the light hits just right. I'd even worn a brooch, the one Derek gave me in '79, thinking perhaps someone would say, "Oh, Grandma, you wore that old thing," and we'd laugh. But no one laughed. No one noticed. I was told not to sit near them, and I obeyed. I sat at a table in the back corner, between an empty chair and a pillar decorated with plastic ivy. I'm 81 years old. I live in a quiet place now, not lonely, just quiet. A complex of pale corridors and reminders taped to the fridge. Mornings are for tea and pillboxes, evenings for reruns, and windows left open just a little too long. My neighbors forget my name, but always remember their laundry schedule. No one asks me questions that aren't multiple choice, but last Saturday, I wasn't invisible. Not exactly. I was something else, visible but unwanted. I was the cost of their comfort, the person whose name they used to buy flowers and folding chairs, but whose presence they preferred blurred. The reunion was held at one of those rented event spaces near the lake, all polished floors and exposed beams pretending to be rustic. It had a wall of windows looking out onto water that shimmered artificially, like a screensaver. They'd strung up lights, rented matching linens, and printed custom napkins with the family crest. A crest that didn't exist until Lisa decided we needed branding. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, who once told me that tradition was just emotional clutter, but had somehow turned this weekend into a corporate launch party for the Harlow legacy. The invitation had come in the mail, glossy cardstock with embossed lettering, and I'd stared at it for a long time before opening it. There was a section that said, "Donor Recognition Ceremony, Saturday, 6 p.m., and underneath, in smaller print, "Please RSVP for special seating." Special seating, that's what they called it. What it meant was this: you will be seated near enough to be acknowledged, but far enough not to be included. They needed me to fund the event. The catering, the live jazz trio, the monogrammed water bottles, all of it came from my account. They'd asked so gently, Lisa especially. "You know how hard things are, Martha," she'd said over the phone. "It would mean so much to the family if you could be part of making this special." I had nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I always nod. I nodded when Adam first asked me to co-sign the loan for their second house. I nodded when Lisa suggested I gift them the old silver early, so the children could use it now while you're still here. I nodded when they told me that flying to visit them twice a year was a bit much, and when they stopped sending birthday cards with more than a typed signature. I nodded until I forgot how to do anything else. And so, of course, I said yes to the funding. I wrote a check for $12,000, enough to cover the venue, the food, and the professional photographer Lisa insisted was essential. "It's not just a party," she said. "It's about documenting heritage." She said the word heritage like she'd earned it. I didn't ask where the Harlow heritage was in the 5 years they left me out of Christmas plans, or the 3 years they forgot my birthday entirely. I didn't mention that heritage, for me, was the way my mother taught me to fold linens with the corners just so, or how my late husband Derek used to whistle when he painted the porch every spring. I didn't remind her that heritage was something you live, not something you print on napkins. I arrived at the venue early because I always do. Habit, I suppose. When you've spent your life hosting holidays, being early becomes your anchor. I wore my dress, the navy one I mentioned, and polished my shoes the night before. I brought a small wrapped box for Emma, just a necklace I found at the little consignment shop down the street. Something tasteful, simple. She'd always liked jewelry. I hadn't seen her since the last time they passed through town and stayed for exactly 18 hours. That visit, she'd hugged me at the door with one arm, her other hand clutching her phone like it might fly away if she let go. When I arrived, the woman at the check-in table didn't know who I was. "Name?" she asked. Not unkindly, just distracted. When I told her, she looked confused. "Oh, you're the donor," she said, as if I were a silent benefactor from a museum wall. "There's a seat for you near the back, just over there." No escort, no introduction, just a gesture, like I was being shown to a waiting room. I sat down. I watched them arrive, my family. Adam, in a blazer that made him look younger than he is. Lisa, wearing a sleeveless dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Emma and her brother walked ahead, their strides quick, their eyes scanning the room like they were looking for someone important. It wasn't me. They saw me, of course. Emma saw me. She even waved briefly, the kind of wave you give a teacher at the grocery store, and when I stood up, not quickly because nothing I do is quick anymore, and started walking toward them, that's when it happened. Emma leaned toward her mother, whispered something. Lisa didn't react. Adam looked away. Then Emma turned to me and said, clearly, plainly, without venom or warmth, "Grandma, don't sit near us, okay?" She said it like a favor, like I might embarrass them with my presence, with the slow bend of my knees, with my shoes that didn't match their aesthetic. She said it with the practiced ease of someone who has already edited you out of their pictures. And so, I nodded. Of course I nodded, and I sat where they told me. That's what you do when your family makes a request, even when it slices, even when it rewrites who you were to them, even when it takes everything in you not to stand up and say, "I remember when you couldn't sleep without my hand on your back. I remember when I held you through your fever and you whispered, 'Don't leave.'" But I didn't say any of that. I just folded my hands in my lap and looked down at the tablecloth and tried to remember if I'd taken my blood pressure pill. And then the lights dimmed. Lisa took the microphone. "We're so grateful," she said, "to everyone who made this event possible. But especially to one woman, the woman who brought us together, who gave generously so that we could celebrate as a family. Please give a round of applause to our beloved Grandma Martha Reynolds." People turned. They clapped. I stood slowly, because what else can you do? I smiled, though my lips felt brittle. I raised one hand in a soft wave. A camera flash went off. Someone said, "She's so elegant." Another whispered, "I didn't know she was still alive." The applause faded. No one moved to join me. Not Lisa, not Adam, not Emma. They turned back to their wine, their seats, their laughter. I remained standing for a beat too long, then sat down again, alone. And that's when I knew. Not suspected, not feared, knew. I wasn't family anymore. I was a donor, a relic, a name they needed to thank, but not one they needed to know. I didn't leave immediately after the applause died. I sat through dinner. The chicken was dry, the vegetables cold, and no one at my table asked me a single thing except the woman next to me who wanted to know if I'd seen the restroom. I pointed behind her. She didn't return. Around me, the other tables buzzed with conversation, bursts of laughter, the high-pitched yelp of children that no one hushed anymore. Emma posed for photos with her friends in front of the Harlow family reunion banner, smiling wide and angling her body to show her best side, as if this were a red carpet and not the result of a check with my name on it. Lisa flitted from table to table like a hostess at a country club, perfectly pleasant, never once looking in my direction. Adam stayed anchored at the center table, elbows on the tablecloth, phone beside his plate like a security blanket. He didn't look at me. I stopped trying to catch his eye after the third attempt. There are few things more pathetic than a mother trying to make eye contact with her son in a room he dominates. Dessert was a tiered tray of cupcakes, lemon and raspberry, Lisa's favorites, and none of them made it to my table. By then, most of the younger ones had left the assigned seats and clustered together near the lawn. Someone had started music. The older kids danced. The younger ones ran around screaming with cake in their hands. I stood slowly, ignoring the pinch in my knees, and made my way to the exit. No one noticed. No one asked if I needed help. I passed the photographer who smiled at me without recognition. He was reviewing shots on his screen, and I caught a glimpse. The family photo. The one with everyone in matching cream tones, arms around each other, Emma in the middle like a blooming flower, Adam tall and proud beside Lisa. I wasn't in it. I remembered the photo being taken before dinner. I'd gone to the restroom. No one had waited. No one had called for me. Outside, the air was thick with summer heat, the kind that settles behind your knees and under your collar. I walked to the edge of the parking lot and stood there, not sure what I was doing. My car, the same one Adam once called embarrassingly old, sat under a tree near the edge. I looked at it, keys in hand, and felt something thrum in my chest, quiet and unfamiliar. Not rage, not sorrow, something else. A kind of seeing, a moment of full, unfiltered vision. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not neglect. It was intention. They had excluded me, quietly and efficiently. They had stripped me of identity and used what remained, my money, my name, my presence as a photo op, but not as a person, not as a mother, not as a grandmother. I opened my purse and pulled out my wallet. There, tucked in behind my ID, was the folded note I'd written a month earlier. It was meant for my attorney, but I hadn't sent it yet. Just a draft, handwritten, with updates to my estate plan. A scribbled line where Adam's name used to be. I'd meant to think it over. Meant to wait for a moment that felt decisive. I looked at the paper now, creased and faintly smudged from being handled too often, and I knew the moment had arrived. Not in a burst of drama, not with a slam of a door or a shouted confrontation, but with the cold clarity of a woman who'd been erased one too many times. I didn't go home that night. I drove to a small hotel 20 minutes away, one of those roadside places with floral curtains and a breakfast of individually wrapped muffins. I paid in cash. The girl at the desk asked if I needed help with my bag. I declined. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the note. Then I called my attorney. Her name was Jamie, and she answered on the second ring, even on a Saturday. I told her I was ready. Ready for what? She asked. To sign. To make it real. To stop pretending that my son's affection is anything more than a performance he puts on when there's paperwork involved. There was a pause on her end, then a quiet, "Understood." I slept deeply that night, not because the mattress was soft. It wasn't. But because for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to be what they needed. I didn't have to smile just right. I didn't have to ask the right amount of questions or pretend I was fine eating dinner alone. I was just a woman in a hotel room with a suitcase and a pen and a bank account still bearing her name. In the morning, I sat by the window with a styrofoam cup of coffee and watched cars pass by on the highway. I thought about all the small ways they'd trained me to disappear. How I used to bring casseroles and leave before dessert. How I'd been told not to post photos of myself holding the baby because it messes up the aesthetic. How I'd paid for Emma's ballet classes for 3 years but was never invited to a recital. They didn't want me. They wanted a story about me. A benefactor. A harmless, smiling figure who stayed out of the way and paid the bills and nodded when asked. And I had agreed to play that part for so long I forgot there were other roles. But now I remembered. I remembered who I used to be before Adam, before Derek died, before the quiet began. I remembered the version of me who moved across the country alone at 21, who saved every receipt and balanced her checkbook in pen, who once sent back a steak that wasn't cooked right because she'd earned every cent it cost. That woman was still here, buried under decades of compromise. But she was stirring now. After breakfast, I checked out of the hotel and drove into town. I bought a yellow notepad and a new pen, the kind that glides like it knows your secrets. I sat in the park near the lake and began drafting letters. Not to Adam, not yet. To the people who would help me undo the quiet theft that had taken place over years. The financial planner, the second attorney, the notary I'd known since Derek's passing. I made appointments, I made lists, I made a plan. That evening, back in my apartment, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one they told me to sell because it was too big for a small space. Inside were photos, documents, letters, keys to safes they didn't know existed. I pulled out the original will, the trust papers, the health proxy. One by one, I reviewed every signature, every clause, every assumption they had built their comfort around. And with each page, I felt myself return. Not as grandma, not as mother, not as Donner, but as Martha. Just Martha. Whole. Watching them take their bows on the stage I built and finally walking away from the theater altogether. The week that followed passed in a strange, almost suspended rhythm, as if the air around me had thickened slightly, not enough to stop movement, but enough to make it known. I kept my phone off. Not silenced. Off. Powered down, battery dead. Tucked into the drawer where I kept things I didn't want to touch anymore. Expired coupons, unused gift cards, the watch Derek used to wear even after it stopped ticking. I didn't want to hear the apologies, or more likely, the explanations. I didn't want to be told that Emma didn't mean it, or that Adam had just been distracted, or that Lisa was under a lot of pressure. I knew the script. I'd read it too many times, watched too many women play the role of the confused elder being, soothed out of her own rage, so I stepped out of the script. I stayed quiet. And in the silence, I began to feel something unexpected. Not fear, not even sadness. I felt precision, like a blade being sharpened. I started each morning with a task. Not busy work, but intention. I sorted my financial records, digitized old documents, shredded what no longer served me. I found my voice in the language of bank forms and legal clauses. I transferred accounts. I changed beneficiaries. I called my credit union and asked them to reissue my checks with a different mailing address. A post office box I opened quietly, just for me. The woman on the phone asked if there had been a change in circumstances. Yes, I said. I've remembered who I am. She laughed softly, like she thought I was being poetic. I wasn't. I was being exact. At the grocery store, I walked past the aisle where I used to buy Emma's favorite cereal and didn't pause. I didn't reach for it out of habit. I didn't buy the unsalted crackers Adam used to eat when he had a cold. I filled my basket with the things I liked: sharp cheddar, stone ground mustard, the brand of tea Lisa once said tasted like the back of a drawer. I liked that drawer. It had character. The cashier was new, young, nose ring, and nervous fingers. She tried to bag my eggs under the canned beans, and I gently corrected her. She looked up, startled, like she hadn't expected me to speak. Most don't. Most assume you'll nod and shuffle, apologize for being slow, smile too much or too little. But I didn't. I met her eyes. Handle things with care, I said. She blinked, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. I wasn't a ma'am. I wasn't anyone's placeholder for politeness. I was a woman buying her own groceries with her own money after redrawing the map of her life by hand, without GPS, without permission. The apartment itself began to feel different. It had always been mine, technically, but it had also always been a sort of waiting room. I'd moved in after Derek passed, telling myself it was temporary, a landing spot, a transition. But transitions have a way of hardening into permanence when no one is watching. The walls were beige, the furniture functional, the decorations minimal. Lisa had helped me pick most of it out years ago, insisting I keep things simple, by which she meant impersonal. Less clutter, more clarity, she'd said, as if memories were messes. But now I saw it for what it was. A gentle erasure. A palette of neutrality designed to make me forget I'd ever lived a brighter life. So I rebelled. Quietly, methodically. I found my old curtains in a storage bin and hung them again. Blue with tiny sunflowers. I pulled the Afghan I crocheted during the winter of '94 out from the bottom drawer and draped it over the back of the couch. I put up a picture of Derek, the one where his nose is sunburned and he's laughing with his whole body. I added a framed photo of myself, young and full-faced, at a protest in '72, holding a sign and a cigarette. I didn't ask if it clashed with the room. I didn't care. It belonged because I belonged. It was on the 4th day that I found the binder. The one Adam had given me to sign years ago, full of estate instructions, legal preferences, laminated sheets with bullet points, like I was a file waiting to be archived. It was tucked in the linen closet, behind spare sheets I never used. I pulled it out, sat at the table, and flipped through it slowly. There were notes in his handwriting, reminders to himself. Call Mom's bank, check in POA, discuss with Lisa, boundaries. The last one was underlined twice. Boundaries. As if I were the one who crossed lines. As if decades of unpaid labor, late-night babysitting, cooking, forgiving, waiting, bending, as if all of that had been a threat to the tidy borders of the life they wanted to curate. I laughed, not loudly, but fully, a sound that filled the room like fresh air. Then I tore out every page with his notes and fed them into the shredder, page by page, watching the lines disappear into ribbons. That night, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and no lights on, just the dark and the breeze and the sound of my heartbeat slowing. I thought of all the ways they'd trained me to be manageable, how Lisa once said I was low maintenance, and how I'd taken it as a compliment. How Adam used to thank me for being so understanding when they left me off the vacation plans, off the family group text, out of the baby announcement that went to friends of friends but not to me. And I realized with a clarity that should have come years earlier, that kindness, when expected without reciprocity, becomes servitude. That being easy for them had made life hard for me. That every time I'd said, "Don't worry about me," they had learned to take me at my word. And now I didn't want to be easy. I wanted to be undeniable. On the 6th day, I wrote a new letter to Jamie, the attorney. This one wasn't a draft. It was instruction. We scheduled the formal changes: revised power of attorney, updated will, new medical directive, removal of Adam as executor. I listed no replacement. If something happened to me, the state could decide. I trusted bureaucracy more than I trusted the family I raised. Jamie asked if I wanted to add Lisa back as secondary contact. "No," I said. "She's had enough access." Jamie hesitated. "Do you want them notified after your passing?" I paused, then shook my head. "They'll find out when the silence becomes permanent. Until then, let them wonder." The apartment began to feel less like a container and more like a place where I could breathe. I cooked for myself again, not out of necessity, but because I enjoyed the sound of onions hitting butter in a warm pan. I bought spices. I made soup from scratch. I ate slowly, with music playing, and sometimes lit a candle even when no one was coming over. That was the key. I stopped doing things in case someone came. I did them for me. I bought a new bathrobe. Not one from the senior catalog. A real one, thick and absurdly soft, in deep plum. I wore it like armor, like inheritance. I let myself take up space, even if it was only 3 small rooms and a balcony. In the evenings, I started reading again. Real books, not magazines or newsletters, or the recommended titles Lisa once curated for me like I was an algorithm. I read poetry. I read novels where women lived alone and didn't die lonely. I underlined passages that made my chest ache in recognition. One night, I read a line that said, "Some women disappear so gently they don't notice they're gone." I put the book down and cried. Not from grief, from recognition. I had disappeared, slowly, with permission, with thank yous and compliant nods. And now I was coming back. Not loudly, not for attention, but with full knowledge of my name, my voice, my boundaries. That was the escalation. Not rage, not revenge, but return. I came back to myself, fully, quietly, without asking, without telling anyone. It was a Wednesday, when I found myself walking through the city without a plan, my coat unbuttoned and the wind brushing the side of my face like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. I hadn't meant to go far, just to the pharmacy to refill my prescriptions and maybe pick up a new toothbrush. But I kept walking, past the park, past the bakery where I used to take Emma when she was small and still thought whipped cream was magic, past the hardware store where Derek used to spend his Saturday mornings fingering tools he already owned just to have an excuse to talk to the cashier who reminded him of his sister. I walked until I couldn't pretend I was running errands anymore. I was wandering, yes, but not lost. There's a difference. Lost people wait to be found. Wandering people are looking for something even if they can't name it yet. I was the second kind. At least now I was. I stopped outside a bookstore, not a big chain, but a narrow storefront with fogged-up windows and a crooked sign that said, "Open, we think." Inside, it smelled like cedar and paper, and years. No music, no seating area, no displays curated for book clubs, just rows of shelves and a woman with a pencil stuck in her bun and reading glasses that slid slowly down her nose as she looked up and said, "You look like you know what you want," or maybe you're just tired of being told I smiled because it was both. She didn't follow me, didn't offer help, just returned to her crossword behind the counter. I wandered between shelves until my hand fell on a thin volume of poetry I hadn't seen in decades, something I read once in college and told myself I didn't understand, but had kept thinking about anyway. I bought it with cash and left the store holding it close to my chest like a fragile thing. Not the book itself, but the version of me who once believed her heart had room to be moved by metaphors. Back at home, I made tea. Real tea, steeped slowly. None of those quick bags with flavor names like Calm or Joy. And sat in my chair by the window. The sun had started to soften, the kind of light that makes even the dust look graceful. I opened the book and began to read, not aloud, not for show, but for myself. About halfway through, I came across a line that said, "She grew so tired of not being held that she learned to hold herself." It wasn't underlined, not yet, but I reached for a pen and drew a slow line beneath the words, not just to mark them, but to witness them. That's when it happened. Not a revelation, not a thunderclap, but a shift. A small, deep rearranging of something that had been calcified. I realized I no longer wanted an apology. Not from Lisa, not from Adam, not even from Emma. I no longer wanted to be seen. I wanted to see myself. I wanted to be whole in the privacy of my own being, without needing their recognition as proof that I still existed. That was the freedom they had never considered, that I might stop needing them altogether. Later that evening, I pulled out the drawer where I kept my correspondence. Old letters, saved cards, even a few typed notes from Derek when he used to work late and wanted me to know there was soup in the fridge. I read them all. Not to feel sorry, but to remember. Memory is power when it's not nostalgia. It's a mirror. It shows you what you survived and what you abandoned. Among the letters was one from Emma, written in pencil when she was 8. "Grandma, I love you because you make pancakes that smile and you never yell, and your hugs smell warm." I traced the words with my finger, not with sorrow, but with acceptance. That little girl was gone. And so was the woman who made her smile-shaped pancakes. But someone else had emerged in her place. Not lesser, not hollow, just altered. And I had every right to be new. I folded the letter and put it back, not to keep the past alive, but to mark where I had come from. I began to cook differently. Not the meals that had become routine. Casseroles designed for convenience, bland broths for cautious stomachs, but meals that made noise, meals with bite and color. I cooked for myself with the gusto of someone preparing a feast for a guest who would never arrive but was worth impressing anyway. I set the table, even if it was just for one. I poured wine into a real glass. I played music. Not soft background notes, but the kind that made me feel something sharp in my chest. Something that reminded me I was still inside this skin. I danced slowly one night while waiting for the water to boil. Just 3 or 4 steps. Nothing dramatic, just enough to feel my weight, my balance, my pulse. I cried then, yes, but not from sadness, from the recognition of my own aliveness, from the surprise that I hadn't fully disappeared after all, that I still had a center, and I started saying no, not loudly, not defiantly, but with finality. I said no to a neighbor who asked if I'd like to attend her church's senior group, not because I disrespected it, but because I didn't want to be part of any room where being old was the main topic. I said no to the delivery boy who tried to call me sweetie while dropping my groceries off 3 steps from my door. I have a name, I said. Use it. He blinked and apologized. Next week, he did better. And I said no to the small voice in my head that still wanted to explain everything. I didn't need to justify why I was alone. I didn't need to tell myself that they meant well or that maybe I misunderstood. I had understood perfectly. It just took me time to believe myself. This was the shift. The midpoint, if you like tidy story structure. But it didn't feel tidy. It felt like turning a page in a book you didn't think you'd finish and realizing, suddenly, that you want to know how it ends, not because it's beautiful, but because it's yours. It's your handwriting in the margins. Your thumbprint on the dog-eared corner. Your story, finally. It began with an envelope, the kind you don't expect anymore, thick with intention and miscalculation, cream-colored and bearing my full name in a handwriting I knew too well. Adams. It arrived folded in with the local grocery ads and an overdue notice from a gardening magazine I hadn't subscribed to in years, and I almost missed it. I stood in the kitchen holding it by one corner, as though touching it too much might make something seep out. Regret, or worse, a plea. I didn't open it immediately. I set it down on the counter next to the sugar tin, made myself a cup of tea, the kind I now drank slowly and with ceremony, and only once the steam had curled up and kissed my face did I return to the envelope and slit it open with a paring knife. Inside was a letter, 6 pages, handwritten. No greeting, just, "I can't believe you did this." That was his opening sentence. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "We miss you," or even, "Where are you?" Number. His first instinct, as always, was accusation wrapped in disbelief, as though my absence was not a decision, but a betrayal, as though the only story he knew how to tell was the one where I was always waiting and he was always justified. He said I'd caused a scene by absence, that I'd put the family through stress during a weekend meant to unify generations. He wrote that Lisa had cried every night and that the kids were confused and unsettled. There was no mention of the fact that I'd been seated by a pillar, no reference to the moment my own granddaughter had told me not to sit near her, no acknowledgement of the years that had led to this silence, just a recitation of their discomfort, their disbelief, their need for things to return to the version of reality they preferred. He ended the letter with a line that still rings in my ears like the sharp clang of a dropped fork in a quiet room. "We're willing to talk, but only if you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. As if decades of unpaid devotion, of being useful but invisible, of shrinking to fit into the spaces they allowed, as if all of that was unreasonable. I folded the letter slowly, deliberately, not with rage, but with the precision of someone filing a document under a category it now belonged to. Irrelevant. A few days later, Lisa called. I let it go to voicemail. Then came the next escalation. Not a conversation, but a move, a message disguised as a gesture. She showed up in person. I saw her before she saw me, I was walking home from the corner shop, two small bags hanging from my hands, just groceries, nothing indulgent, but mine. My steps were slower now, not from age, but from deliberation. The way someone walks when no one is waiting at home, and that fact no longer stings. She was standing across the street, near the hedge, her coat too polished for our neighborhood, staring at my building with the kind of stiff posture people reserve for graveyards or high-stakes meetings. I didn't cross the street. I turned, walked around the block, and came in through the back entrance. I watched her from the window for several minutes. She didn't knock. She didn't leave a note. She just stood there, glancing at her phone, then finally walked away. It wasn't love that brought her. It was strategy. It was surveillance. The next morning, I received an official-looking email from a man named Derek Sorensen, claiming to be legal counsel representing Adam and Lisa. He used words like concern, well-being, fiduciary duty, and unusual behavior. I read it twice, then once more, not because it was hard to understand, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining the insult. They were trying to frame my independence as instability, my silence as danger, my retreat from their grasp as an act of self-harm. It wasn't just hurtful. It was calculated. They were laying the groundwork to cast me as incapable, to take back control of what I had reclaimed. Not because they missed me, but because they missed my access, my obedience, my money. That afternoon, I walked into the office of a lawyer whose name I'd found through the local women's shelter website, someone who specialized in elder autonomy and financial defense. Her name was Annika, and she had gray braids and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She didn't treat me like a victim. She treated me like a woman with leverage. I explained everything. The history, the reunion, the trust documents, the letters, the lawyer's message. She listened, asked clear questions, took notes on a yellow pad with the efficiency of someone who had helped many women escape polite prisons. We drafted a formal response. It was crisp, clinical, and final. I was of sound mind. I was in a safe environment. I had retained independent counsel, and any further attempts to control my finances or question my capacity would be considered harassment. I signed it with a pen that didn't tremble. She mailed it by certified post. I left her office lighter than I had walked in, not because anything was resolved, but because I had declared something real. I wasn't theirs anymore. The letter must have landed hard, because the next knock came sooner than expected. I was working in the small garden plot behind the building, just a few herbs and a stubborn tomato plant, when I saw him. Adam, my son, standing at the edge of the path, arms crossed, a look on his face I'd seen too many times. The one he wore when his team lost a soccer game in high school, and he needed someone to blame. I didn't rise to greet him. I didn't put down my trowel. I just kept working. He waited, then finally said, "Mom, this is getting out of hand." I glanced up, tilted my head, and asked, "What is?" He sputtered something about the lawyer, the letter, the embarrassment, the tension it was causing within the family. He used the word family like it was currency, as if invoking it would grant him moral superiority. I didn't flinch. "You left me by a ficus tree," I said quietly. "At the reunion I paid for." He rolled his eyes, the way Emma does when she thinks I don't understand TikTok, and said, "That's not what happened. You're twisting things." And there it was. The rewrite. The attempt to edit the story to protect his comfort. I stood then, slowly, wiped my hands on my apron, and said, "You don't get to control the version I live through." He took a step back, surprised maybe, or just recalculating. We were worried, he tried. Then you should have called, I said. Before the lawyer. Before the letters. Before the theater. He didn't answer. He looked down at his shoes. When he looked up again, I saw it. Not guilt. Not remorse. Calculation. He was deciding what angle to try next. I just think, he said, that maybe you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. I smiled, not kindly. That's rich coming from the man who cried when I wouldn't co-sign a third mortgage. That landed. His face twitched. Then, as always, he pivoted. This isn't about money, he said. It's about legacy. About what kind of family we are. I leaned in slightly so he'd hear me clearly. We are the kind of family that forgets who held the camera. I turned and walked away, dirt still on my hands, not because I was dramatic, but because I had nothing left to give to a man who only visited when something slipped from his grasp. That night, I found a small envelope under my door. No return address. Just a single photograph inside. Me, holding Emma when she was small, both of us laughing. Her face smushed against mine. On the back, in her handwriting, it said, I remember. Nothing else. No explanation. No apology. But it was enough to let something shift again. She hadn't written me off completely. She just hadn't known how to reach me through the noise of her mother's performances. I didn't write back. Not yet. But I took the photo and placed it in the frame that once held a picture of Lisa and Adam at their wedding. I didn't throw that photo away. I just took it down. That, I've learned, is its own kind of defiance. Not destruction, but replacement. And so the escalation continued, not with shouts or slamming doors, but with small moves, like chess played by ghosts. They tried to reach out through other relatives. A cousin's email, a shared friend's voicemail, a card that arrived with no signature, but included a note about how family shouldn't be divided. I didn't respond. Not because I was stubborn, but because I finally understood the difference between building bridges and walking back into traffic. Some bridges burn on their own. You don't need to strike the match. It was the second Saturday in September when I finally carried out what I had been building toward in silence for weeks. Not in secret exactly, but in solitude, which I've come to learn is more powerful. Secret keeping implies shame. Solitude requires strength. That morning, I dressed not for comfort or modesty, but for clarity. I wore a gray dress with a soft belt, no jewelry, no makeup, hair combed back in a low twist the way I used to wear it when I gave lectures at the college before Adam was born. I wanted to see myself in the mirror and recognize a woman capable of irreversible action. Because that's what it would be. Irreversible. I had made appointments, signed documents, filed notices, removed names. I had already rewritten the will, replaced the executor, redistributed the trust. But none of it would feel real. Not truly. Until I took this final step. I left my apartment holding a plain envelope. Inside were 5 letters. One to each member of the family who had assumed I would die quietly beneath their expectations. One for Adam, one for Lisa, one for Emma, one for Jamie, the attorney, confirming my last decisions, and one for myself, which I would not open. It was not a letter to be read, only written, to mark the end of a performance I had carried too long. I walked to the notary's office on Main Street, the one next to the barber shop that still smelled like talc and old radios. The notary, a woman named Clara, knew me slightly from church. Not well enough to ask questions, but well enough to say, "You look like a woman on a mission." I smiled and said, "I am." I handed her the documents. She checked my ID, stamped them in, silence, and said, "You're all set, Martha." The finality of it landed gently, like a door clicking shut behind you, not slammed, but soundproof. I thanked her, stepped outside, and walked 3 blocks to the bank. There, I requested a cashier's check made out to an organization I had researched for months, a scholarship fund for adult women returning to school after the age of 60. I made the donation in memory of no one. I simply wrote, "For the women who were told it was too late." I had removed the family as beneficiaries not out of vengeance, but liberation. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was removing the bait. For years, they had pretended to care with one eye on the prize, waiting for the reading of a will like it was the finale of a long, boring series they couldn't quite fast forward through. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a payout, and I wasn't going to give myself the burden of hoping the inheritance might buy their love retroactively. The bank manager, a tall man with kind eyes, asked if I wanted to alert the prior designees. I said, "No. They'll learn the way I did when the heir leaves the room." He nodded, didn't press, printed the confirmation and slid it across the desk. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. I took the receipt and placed it in my bag like one would tuck away a passport, a document of safe passage. The last stop was the post office. I mailed the 4 letters. No return address. No need. They would recognize the handwriting, and if they didn't, then they never deserved to. The letters were not cruel, but they were final. I told them what I had done, not why. They knew why, even if they would pretend not to. I didn't recount the indignities. I didn't relive the humiliation of that reunion, the whispers, the polite neglect, the way Emma's voice had cut through me like ice in a glass. I didn't mention the years of small thefts, of time, of presence, of attention. I simply said, "This is not a punishment. This is the conclusion of a role I no longer wish to play." I told them I wished them peace. I told them I would not be contacting them again, and I meant it. When I returned home, I made myself a small meal. A piece of fish, lightly salted, pan-seared, green beans with lemon, 1 square of chocolate. I set the table. I lit a candle. I poured a glass of water and sat. Not as a matriarch, not as a mother, not as a ghost in someone else's family story, but as a woman who had pulled herself out of a narrative written for her by people who saw her as a utility rather than a soul. I chewed slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't rehearse any imaginary confrontations. I didn't check the phone. I didn't wonder if they'd respond. I had done what I came to do. Later that evening, I took out the 5th letter, the one I had written to myself, and placed it, unopened, in the same cedar chest where I kept the old photographs, the saved postcards, the small notes that used to make my heart leap. The letter wasn't a time capsule. It was a grave marker, a quiet burial for the version of me who waited, who hoped, who bent until she became unrecognizable even to herself. I placed it gently under the layer of folded linens and closed the chest. I did not cry, not because there was no pain, but because the pain had finally been named. And when pain has a name, it has somewhere to go. Mine had found its place. That night, I slept not with satisfaction, but with silence, the kind of silence that follows not triumph, but truth. I did not feel victorious. I felt real. And sometimes that is the greatest climax of all. To live not in a fantasy of repair, but in the dignity of release. It has been 3 months since I mailed those letters, and no one has come to my door. No knocks, no flowers, no sudden apologies written on folded stationery. There was one email from Emma, short, cautious, unsigned. "I understand," it said. Nothing more. I didn't reply, not out of spite, but because there are silences that speak more honestly than any answer. I've stopped checking the mailbox with expectation. These days, I open it only for the mundane, utility bills, the occasional catalog, and sometimes a note from the woman 2 floors down who likes to bake too much and give slices away in paper towels. I accept her banana bread, her apple crumble, even when I don't feel like sweets. Not because I owe her anything, but because it's a clean kind of kindness, one that doesn't trail demands behind it like a shadow. I water my plants. I watch the way they turn toward the window each morning, like they've never once doubted where the light is. I've learned from that. I no longer beg for warmth from sources that offer only flickers. My days have become quieter in a way that doesn't ache. I've filled them not with noise, but with presence. I read, I walk, I sit. I don't narrate myself in my head anymore. I don't think they would be proud, or they'd regret this if they saw me now. I don't measure my recovery by how much they might miss me. I no longer live inside their absence. Once a week, I visit the library and sit near the window where the afternoon light turns the floor golden. I've made something of a ritual of it. I pick one book, sometimes poetry, sometimes fiction, never biography, and I read without checking the time. The librarian, a young woman with chipped nail polish and a gentle way of speaking, once asked if I was waiting for someone. I said, "No, I'm already here." She smiled in a way that told me she understood, maybe more than she could explain. I think sometimes that the greatest gift we can give another woman is to stop pretending. To look her in the eye and let her know, I see you and I know you're real, even if the people closest to you pretend otherwise. So I look people in the eye now. I nod at women in grocery aisles. I make room on the bench at the bus stop, not because I'm lonely, because I remember what it was like to feel erased. And I will not contribute to that silence again. I still keep the photograph of Emma and me on the shelf. Not because I'm waiting for her to come back, but because it reminds me I was once loved, even if the memory of it dimmed in her over time. Love, I've learned, is not made permanent by genetics or history. It has to be practiced. It has to be spoken. It has to be honored. And if it's not, well, then it becomes nostalgia, not connection. I don't traffic in nostalgia anymore. I traffic in reality, in the dignity of my own breath, in the agency of my days, in the quiet, clean pleasure of not being watched, not being judged, not being rearranged. If another woman ever finds this letter, this voice, these pieces I've laid out, I hope she understands that she is allowed to leave the table where her name is used, but her presence is not welcome. She's allowed to stop feeding the hands that only reach for her when there's something to take. She is allowed to begin again at any age. And when she does, it won't be cinematic. It won't be perfect. It will sting. But it will also heal. Slowly, like scar tissue. Firm, imperfect, but proof that something closed. So here I am, 81. alone in the legal sense, but not adrift. I make my tea strong. I sleep with the window open. I answer to no one and apologize only when I mean it. I'm not waiting anymore. Not for recognition, not for reconciliation, not for a chair at a table I built. I've made my own place now. It is small, quiet, and entirely mine. And I sit exactly where I want.